All right, let's talk about something that sounds pretty chaotic: hyperinflation. We're going to dive into the brand new accounting rules that are trying to bring some order to that madness. I mean, think about it. How do you keep your books straight when a country's currency is basically in free fall? So, here's the big question. How do you report stable finances when the currency you're using is anything but stable? Imagine this. You're trying to measure a room, but your measuring tape is shrinking right in your hands. That is exactly the challenge companies are up against in these hyperinflationary economies. It's the core problem we're going to unpack today. Well, for years, the answer was, let's just say, complicated. It was a total mess. Companies were using all these different exchange rates for different parts of the financial statement. But now, a big change to International Accounting Standard 21, that's IAS 21, has basically swept all that complexity away. And what did they replace it with? One single consistent rate. Talk about a massive shift towards making things clearer.
Okay, so let's get into the why. Why was this change so desperately needed? Well, to really get why the new rule is so great, we've got to first understand the chaos it was designed to fix.
First things first, what is a hyperinflationary economy? In simple terms, it's where inflation is just completely out of control. The money you have in your pocket today, it's going to be worth a lot less tomorrow. And you can see how that makes regular old accounting, which is built on the idea of a stable currency, not just difficult, but really, really misleading.
And here's the real kicker. The big risk with the old way of doing things was this massive distortion of a company's value. Think about it. By using this jumble of old and new exchange rates, a really important part of the balance sheet, called the translation reserve, could just balloon or shrink like crazy. And the scary part? It had nothing to do with how the company was actually doing. It was just financial noise, pure static, making it impossible to see what was really going on. And that is where the new rule comes in. It's a simple but really powerful solution. At its heart, it's all about one thing: using one single rate to finally bring some consistency back to the balance sheet. Okay, take a look at this. What's so cool here is just how simple the change is when you see it side by side. On the left, you've got the old way, the previous practice. It was a total patchwork, right? A rate for assets, another for equity, another for expenses, just so complicated. But now look at the new rule on the right. It doesn't matter if it's assets, liabilities, income, expenses, or even equity, the whole shebang. Everything gets translated using just one number, the closing rate. Simple as that. And that's the result right there. This is the payoff. By using that one consistent rate, you get rid of those wild, unpredictable swings in the translation reserve we were just talking about. What does that mean for the bottom line? Well, the financial statements become way more stable, a lot more predictable, and honestly, just a much truer reflection of where the company actually stands.
Okay, so the basic idea is pretty straightforward. But what happens when things get a little more complex? Let's talk about what I like to call the parent company puzzle. This is what happens when you have a parent company that's stuck in a hyperinflationary economy, but it needs to consolidate the results from its subsidiary, which is operating in a totally stable one. Now that's a challenge. So how do you solve this puzzle? Well, the new rule breaks it down into two really clear steps. Step one, for this year's numbers, you keep it simple. You just translate the subsidiary's finances using that same closing rate we've been talking about. Easy. But step two is where it gets clever. To compare this year to last year, you can't just use the old numbers as they were. So you restate last year's data using something called a general price index, which is just a fancy term for an official measure of inflation. What this does is it adjusts last year's numbers to account for the parent company's crazy home inflation. That way, you're actually comparing apples to apples. It makes the comparison meaningful. Now, the good news is hyperinflation doesn't have to last forever. Economies can and do stabilize. So what happens then? Well, the new rules have thought of that too. They provide a really clear off-ramp for getting back to normal. It's actually super straightforward. The second an economy is officially out of the hyperinflationary zone, the company just stops. They stop using these special rules and switch right back to the standard way of doing things. And here's the key part. They only apply this change from that day forward. It's what accountants call prospective application. In plain English, it means they don't have to go back and rework all their past financial statements, which, believe me, makes for a much smoother transition. All right, we've covered the how, but there's one last crucial piece to this puzzle: transparency. Because, with big new rules like this, you've got to tell people what you're doing. It's all about building trust with investors and the public. And the requirements are pretty simple, but really important. First, Companies have to come right out and say, hey, we're using these new amendments. No hiding it. Second, if they have any of those foreign operations we talked about, they need to provide some summarized financial info for them. Why does this matter? It gives everyone, investors, analysts, you name it, a clear line of sight into exactly how hyperinflation is affecting the bottom line.
So when you boil this whole thing down, what's the big idea? What's the goal? It's really about these 3 C's. Consistency, so everyone's doing it the same way. Clarity, so the numbers actually make sense. And comparability, so you can actually compare one company to another, or this year to last year. That's the end game.
And that really just leaves us with one final big picture thought. Look, these new rules are without a doubt a huge step forward in trying to account for chaos. But, as our global economies face all sorts of new and unpredictable pressures, you have to wonder, will this be enough? Will these rules be enough to keep financial reporting truly honest and clear, no matter what the future throws at us?